Before the war, my heart was light. My life stretched out before me. I had 1,000 years to go and 1,000 wonderful dreams to grow. But that was all so long ago. Before the war.
The outpouring of grief at the death of Abraham Lincoln befit a nation that had lost its youth. How much talent lay buried in war graves? What scientific discoveries would these men have made, and what books would they have written? What paintings would they have created? What political leaders would they have produced? But even those men who had survived the war were no longer young. They were old from their experiences. And they came home to a nation already dramatically changing. Had Thaddeus Stevens, who was virtually a dictator in the House of Representatives, and Charles Sumner in the Senate had their way, the nation would have changed even more than it did. These two men set out to alter the very form of American government. And to this end, these radicals passed a law taking away the president's role as commander-in-chief of the Army. They passed another which denied him control over his own cabinet. And finally, they impeached President Johnson. Anger with Johnson had grown steadily from the moment that some congressmen discovered that this Southerner planned to carry out Lincoln's policy toward the South. Lincoln had expressed this policy in his second inaugural speech when he said, "With malice toward none and with charity for all." But the radicals wished to punish the South. The South had increased the anger and determination of the radicals with their black codes. These codes had the effect of keeping the Negro little better than a slave. They even included the possibility that all persons strolling in idleness would be put in chain gangs. The radicals used the codes to whip up political backing. In Congress, they excluded men from rebel states. They blocked a Supreme Court decision against military rule and allowed the Army to rule the South. And they refused to allow payment of Confederate debts. The impeachment trial of President Johnson took place in the Senate from March to May in 1868. A two-thirds vote in the Senate was required for a conviction. Undecided senators became the victims of threatened pressure. While the country waited, the Senate voted. Tensions ran so high that Senator Ross of Kansas felt, as he cast the deciding vote against impeachment, that he was looking into his open grave. With the Confederacy defeated, many Northerners packed their suitcases made of carpeting, and they headed south. These carpetbaggers, as the South called them, often had a sincere desire to help rebuild a new South. And these men accomplished needed things, such as help for starving and horseless people, white or Negro. Others, however, came to see what they could get for themselves in the way of power or riches. And they were joined by the scalawags. That's what the Southern opportunists were called, those who aided the radical Republicans. They were protected by the Union Army, and they stole and cheated. In the South, secret societies organized to oppose the radical governments. But decent Southerners left these groups when the groups turned to murder and robbery to gain their ends. The South's greatest need was money to build on, but at the war's end, much of the South's property had been seized by Union agents and sold to pay war debts. The agents kept most of the money themselves. Schools couldn't be built without money, and so many white and Negro children received no education. Planters borrowed money to plant crops and ended up losing their land to the new merchants. Without money to pay for their labor, planters persuaded the ex-slaves to stay on the land for a share of the crop, and the sharecropping system emerged.
The soil is wearing out, and so is my life. I'm fighting the land and it's all struggle and strife. But I'll still raise my children, I'll still keep my wife. And though this is a fight I can never quite win, I'm a tough, stubborn man, and I'll never give in. Sharecropping shows no profit, it's true. Sharecropping's the only thing that I can do.
By 1876, General Grant's 2 terms as president had proven the most corrupt in history. Scandal after scandal had rocked his administration. Though he was honest himself, his friends and his appointees had looted the country. In large cities, city officials were doing the same thing. For a nation tired of corruption and violence, the Republicans ran an unquestionably honest Ohioan, Rutherford B. Hayes, for president. When the election ended, Samuel Tilden, the Democratic candidate, needed only 1 more electoral vote to win, and 4 states had not yet filed their returns. With the Union Army still there to protect them, the Radicals put their vote forward as the legitimate one. Throughout the South and the West, tempers flared, and many felt the election had been stolen. By February in 1877, another civil war appeared likely. A group of Southerners who looked for a new South of trade and industry helped prevent an outbreak of violence. They backed the Republican Hayes as the duly elected president, and later that year, he recalled federal troops from the South. The 12-year occupation of the South was over. Reconstruction came to an end. Over the next 20 years, the new South politicians went down to defeat. The Southern white farmer and the Southern white worker sank to a condition little better than slavery. But as they sank, they used what power they had remaining to push the Negro lower still. One cause of the rapid changes after the Civil War was the war itself. It had flooded the North with money for war production, and the money helped finance the transition from the age of iron to the age of steel. Producing iron had been possible wherever ore and coal and water power to run bellows were found close together, such as the iron works along the Antietam River that had made Harper's Ferry a good choice for a federal arsenal. Steel required coal and iron, water and limestone in such vast amounts that a network of railroads stretched across the continent. Lines of barges followed each other on rivers, canals, and lakes, and steel ships reached across the ocean to bring in the necessary raw materials. All of this required huge investments of money, so business and finance grew. Thousands of immigrants crossed from Europe to work in the mines and in the mills. Green valleys soon were blackened with the grit from locomotives and the dust from the collieries. Canals that had been put out of business by the expanding railroads became open sewers. Streams were poisoned with acids which ran off from slag heaps and mines. In the steel towns, clouds of smoke shut out the sun by day and reflected the glow of the furnaces at night. Fish and bird life died. Many old-timers and children wondered why this was called progress. The 1850s had been the golden age of the clipper ships. The fastest were made in New England shipyards, drawing upon the once abundant timber resources of the region. These wooden sailing ships ranked among the great works of art and engineering the world has ever known. But they couldn't carry enough cargo to compete with all steel ships. As the heavier vessels appeared with growing frequency, those shipyards closer to the steel centers prospered, and the century of world dominance by the shipbuilders of New England ended. The heavier steel ships required deeper water, and so, one by one, the shallow water ports turned to other pursuits, and the deep water ports like New York, San Francisco, and Baltimore grew in population as more and more ships concentrated in fewer ports. Into these cities came more and more highways and railroads to carry the goods to and from the piers. Steel became the backbone of industry. Oil became the lifeblood. Steel pipe reached deeper year by year, bringing forth the black gold. And as the world turned from whale oil to petroleum to keep the nation's lamps going, the whaling ports of the Northeast lapsed into history, and an adventurous way of life drew to a close. But the Steel Age offered new challenges. St. Louis needed to span the Mississippi with a bridge that would not obstruct steamboats. But for this job, they needed someone who knew the bottom of the river, who knew, for instance, that the river bed itself moved downstream, and that heavy objects could actually dig downward as much as 80 feet as the current undermined them. They gave the job to a man who had never before built a bridge, James Eads. Using a diving bell that he had invented, he learned the river, diving to salvage sunken steamboats. During the war, he built ironclad Union gunboats for use on the river. And now, in 1867, he began the first structure in America to use steel. Anchoring the piers of his bridge in solid rock, 123 feet below the surface, marked a great engineering feat and a heroic struggle. Every worker got a daily physical examination before entering the caissons. These were large working chambers located deep below the surface of the river, where air pressure had to be maintained the same way that it is in sea diving operations. Nevertheless, 12 men died from bends, and 2 were crippled permanently. After the struggle with the piers, the steel arches were a simple task, although Eads had to develop a new chrome steel for the purpose. While Eads built his arch bridge, a father and son team in New York City began to build what was, for decades, the world's longest suspension bridge. John Roebling had invented the steel cable, and his son, Washington Roebling, had built bridges for the Union Army. When ferry services from Brooklyn Village to Manhattan Island in New York were halted by ice, the city officials of New York finally decided time had come for construction of a bridge. The Roeblings willingly took this task. No one paid a higher price for engineering triumph than did the Roeblings. Fighting one of the numerous fires that broke out in the caissons during the digging, Washington got the bends from the change of air pressure. And with his health permanently ruined, Washington Roebling supervised the construction from his bedroom overlooking the East River. He used a telescope to follow the progress and dictated instructions to his wife.
The Brooklyn Bridge was now begun, designed by John Roebling, built by his son. From Manhattan to Brooklyn, where the East River flows, its towers and cables soon arose, and today, across its pavement, the traffic still streams. This structure of granite, steel, and dreams.
From the day of its completion, it became one of the most famous structures in the world, and many people consider it one of the most beautiful. A work of art with 2 granite pillars supporting a sweeping web of steel. As more and more bridges spanned rivers and bays, ferry boats tied up at their slips for the last time, or they steamed off to more remote crossings.
How a lot of water has passed under the bridge by now. But the old Brooklyn Bridge doesn't look so old, considering the number of times it's been sold.
The building of a great industrial nation requires many sacrifices, but often the people to make the sacrifices are the laborer and the farmer. Millions of people lived in poverty and ill health in this country in the last century, while the steel mills arose and the mines deepened, networks of railroads expanded, and huge factories were built. Waves of immigrants arrived from Europe and Asia, attracted by the need for labor. Often these immigrants are recruited as strikebreakers until they themselves became the strikers, and then a new wave followed. In times of depression, the number of jobs grew scarce, and the number of men available for the jobs increased in number. Long lines of desperate men formed at factory gates seeking work, and this drove wages still lower.
Not enough jobs and too many men, not enough jobs to go round. I've tried every factory again and again, and there isn't a job to be found. There isn't a job to be found anywhere. There isn't a job to be found.
To protect themselves from such hardships, laborers organized unions where all acted as one. The main weapon of a union was the refusal of anyone in the union to work. Now this meant to strike. If a mass of workers willing to work could be brought into the area, well, then the strike would fail. During the years of depression, such workers were easy to find. In 1870, the country reached the very bottom of a depression that began in 1873. Railroads cut the wages of their workers, and all over the East, violence broke out. Angry workers seized key towns and railroad points, stopping almost all traffic. State militias, called out to restore order, joined the strikers. With the nation apparently on the brink of revolution, federal troops were sent into action, and over 100 people were killed. An alarmed public, still sensitive to the recent Civil War, sided with the federal troops, and the strike was broken.
We had things going our way when the federal troops marched in. The federal troops came in. The federal troops came in. The state militia joined us, for they wouldn't fight their kin. But the strike was finally broken when the federal troops came in. And when the federal troops come in, you can't win. You can't win.
In 1886, a policeman was killed by a bomb explosion in Chicago's Haymarket Square. A riot followed, killing 7 more policemen. A number of labor leaders were sentenced to death or prison for this, even though they were not present, and no one could be certain who had actually thrown the bomb. Shocked Americans protested what one called judicial murder, that is, murder by a legal court method. On July 6, 1892, the struggle between labor and industry became an actual war with a planned battle. At Homestead, Pennsylvania, laborers stopped an army of 300 heavily armed Pinkerton detectives hired by the steel industry to invade the town. While 15,000 people watched, the strikers used cannon and dynamite. Now this forced the Pinkerton army to surrender, and the strikers had won. But only for the moment. Once again, public opinion swung against organized labor. Employers cracked down on labor organizations. They blacklisted the leaders that kept them from finding work elsewhere. And they locked out workers who protested, refusing to let them come to work. They hired spies to report on union meetings, and they hired armed hoodlums to break up labor gatherings. In those years, the courts almost always aided business against labor. A majority of Americans seemed to feel that the right to form groups and organizations belonged only to business and industry. It was also an accepted philosophy that the work of business was brutally competitive.
'Twas a bitter time for the working man, a bitter time indeed. A blacklist ban for the union man with a family to feed. And dog eat dog was the business rule, an uncharitable creed. 'Twas a bitter time for the working man, a bitter time indeed.
East or west, the laborer faced overwhelming odds. South or west, the farmer found himself trapped by forces he could not control. And out on the Great Plains, Indian and buffalo, open range or rolling grassland, longhorns and cattlemen, the last frontier. Each in its turn would be conquered by the age of steel.